trout or 10 times of rockfish in a model without them out-competing each other by having this. We don't see this self-simplification anymore. We can still get it if we say on certain conditions, but it's not something that characterizes the model. You can put it in. And when I say this, it's based on quite a bit of experience. We again is not the royal we here, have analyzed about 50 ecosystems where we fitted the models to time series. Cam had done quite a few of them. They have been working with it, and a few other ones in here as well. There's quite a bit of experience now on fitting ecosystem model time series data. And what that really translates to is to write ecosystem history, the history of the exploited ecosystem. That's what we replicate in this modeling. I'll just give you one example. That's from where I'm working by Vancouver, the Strait of Georgia, where several people worked with this, but one was a PhD student of mine called Dave Prykstad, who finished a few years ago. So he put together all the time series, the big ecosystem model, and then he modeled for different groups in this model how the observed estimates, how he could fit them with the ecosystem model over time. About 20 or 30 different time series went into this, so fairly complicated one. This is a pretty standard now for how we do that. Some use 50 or 100 different time series. We try to fit the model to these time series data by estimating a few parameters. Behind this, however, is what has happened to the environment. That's one of the factors we look at. How has that changed? So what Dave Prykstad did in this study here, as part of his PhD work, was to model how primary production, according to the time series, to the model, have changed over time. So he got a curve for how it changed over time, and then he had his undergraduate degree was in oceanography. He looked for environmental indicators, and for this one, in this case here, for this is one of the models he worked with. He worked with different models, different scales. He found, as an oceanographer, that the appropriate measure that fitted this, that's the dots here, that was a measure of salt water down by Victoria. This is influenced by upwelling west of and river runoff. So a measure from there gave a nice fit. Something that resembled the signal that we saw in the ecosystem. The ecosystem will just try to find we can ask it to find a primary production anomaly. Just like in fisheries science, we try to find a recruitment anomaly. We can also find a primary production anomaly. We found this strong correlation there in this case. This is just one. We've had a number of these studies now, and they're pointing in the same direction, all of these studies. And that direction is, if we are to understand what has happened in an ecosystem, we need to understand the food web, what happens there. We need to consider that. But that won't do. We also need to consider how the environment has changed over the period we're looking at and how that impacts the ecosystem. And we need to understand the human factors that has influenced it. It's the combination of those three that is required for us to rewrite this ecosystem history. That's the lesson we learned from the study. And what this really boils down to is, no, it was not just that the butler did it. That was traditionally the guilty person. It's not always just a question of the fisheries went out and they wrecked the ecosystem. There's more to it. There are more guilty parties in this. There are more aspects to this. And one important aspect of this is really we can start with this to look at what's the relative contribution of the environment, of the food web, and of the fisheries, or other anthropogenic effects on what has happened in this ecosystem. It gives us some capabilities that almost makes us think that we can start making predictions. We are at least getting closer when we have a model that can replicate the history. I, for one, would be a little bit less hesitant to use such a model for predictions than if I had no idea about how it would have behaved in the past. So this is a really major step for modeling that we've been able to move this far. That's the first half. Almost. Well, I had hoped to actually to do this in 45 minutes, and let's see. We started a little bit late. A few people were. Anyway, what I want to do now is to turn to a few aspects of EcoPOD. Does everyone know what this guy is about?
You better explain.
When I started working with EcoPOD in 1990, I moved to ICLAM in the Philippines, International Center for Aquatic Resources Management. Spent 10 years there, so I learned how to say that name, what ICLAM means. And of course, once I left, they also closed the door and renamed themselves the World Fish Center. So 10 years learning, and you can see how hopeless things can be when ICLAM. At ICLAM, my job there when I moved there, I was sent by Danish International Development Agency, was to do multi-species management, multi-species modeling, to introduce that to tropical countries, developing countries. So Daniel had heard about EcoPOD, and we picked it up, and I started running with this project in 1990. And I don't know why, but soon after, I put in this model, there are no fishes on island, to indicate, we're talking about food web and connectedness. And the next year, our head of publications there, he made our nice annual report, and he mocked me slightly with this drawing here. And that has become the logo of EcoPOD. Yeah, it's cute. Now, EcoPOD has 29 years history by now. We had a 25-year love feast in 2009 in Vancouver, and this year we're going to have a 30-year anniversary in Barcelona. And it has developed a lot, and it's developed to what I earlier called a modeling framework. I'll give you a little bit of idea about that. But first, it's a nice, slick software in many ways, very capable and very flexible. That's one thing. So it's very, very easy to get started with, just like Photoshop. And I think many of us are able to go into Photoshop. I'm proud of myself. I can go into Photoshop and I can remove a background from a picture, or from a drawing or something, a figure. I often go in and remove it. I can remember how to do that. I think, though, Photoshop can do a little bit more than that. See, that's the same here. There's a lot of depth behind it, and way more than Cam would be able to, or anyone would be able to cover in a course. And I will only give you a few highlights, some of the things I find interesting. And I'm going to be focusing, when I get there, on the aspects of spatial modeling as a very important component of that. Because that's an area where I see a lot of development in recent years, a lot of really interesting development, plus potential for further development. So this is, to me, a really hot area, as you can probably recognize from this map here, which is here in your honor, even though I can't find where you are, and that's somewhere over there. We have worked with this for quite a while, and about 5, 6, 7 years ago, we realized that we had hit a barrier in this development, EcoPOD 5. I had been doing most of the programming, and Carl most of the smart work in it, algorithms and that kind of things, and we moved along, but we were hitting this barrier that we had to, it was becoming too complicated to work with this. It was not modular, it was one big spaghetti package, and we basically had a project to redevelop it. And that led to one important aspect, several important. One is we modularized it completely. And it's actually something that works. So the data sources and the core and the scientific interface are separated. See, that's one reason why we could do this 3D gaming you saw in the beginning, that there's a complete separation between the scientific interface and the computational core. So the scientific interface or the gaming interface or any other interface can have access to the information it needs and can display that in various forms. That's a smart thing. Even smarter than that is what we call plugins. Plugins are places you can sit outside the software, the actual code there. And from a software module in the plugin, you have access to things in there. So when, for instance, we have a sequence of events in a model, we have all these plug-in points where you have access to data and where you have access to the modules, which basically means you don't like the way the foraging arena is working, want to try something else, we'll replace it. Let's put something else in. You want different ways of expressing things or doing things, it's open for it. It's actually something that's happened in quite a number. I think we have about 20 or so modules, external modules that go in there, grab things, use the database, do different kind of things. And this is an area that from a developer's point of view, from a modeler's point of view, is really interesting. Because it means it opens up for the databases that are used for this, for doing different kinds of analysis. EcoTroph is one good example. Didier Gasquel in Rennes in France, he's not using EcoPOD, he's using the data that goes into EcoPOD for a total different representation of how an ecosystem is organized based on trophic levels, basically, instead of based on functional species. But this is the kind of things that becomes available, possible, straightforward actually, because it's a model approach. So that's one area which I think is really important, and there are a number of these. So if you work with modeling, the whole idea on these plugins is really, really neat. It's very, very flexible. Lots of things happening. I'm just going to give you an example now of such a plugin. One I've been working quite a bit on. It's called the value chain. And where before we were looking at the environment, impacting ecosystem, fish species, and producers, the fishing boats, that's our normal ecosystem model. Here, what we added to that is we follow the seafood all the way up to the consumer. From sea to plate, as DFO in Canada likes to call it. We model this, and when you think about that, what that means is we get very different from what the economist tells us normally is interesting for fisheries. You know, that they tend to focus on like profit in the fishing industry, on the boats, that's about it. But there's much more to it. So that's where we can look at that here. We can even look at what the consequences are of changes on one factor here on what may end up there. That's what it opens for. And over the last 3 years, I've worked with economists in Peru, where they have the world's biggest fishery, on describing the Peruvian fishery sector. Now, I'm sure you all know about Peruvian fisheries, and I'm sure that you, like anyone else, thinks anchoveta. The world's biggest fishery is a single species fishery for anchoveta. That's what characterizes the Peru fisheries in everybody's mind, including people in Peru, even though there's no place you get better seafood than in Peru, in my humble opinion. So over the last 3 years, I worked with a couple of economists down there who have been going out to the ports, landing places, and see how much fish goes through here, what is the cost of the fish, what's the selling price, how is it sold for, how many people are involved in processing this per ton. And that's been done throughout the whole industry. So we have the fishing fleet. This here down here, that's the traditional view of fisheries economics. It stops there. Adding these things on top, middlemen, canning, curing, fresh seafood, local markets, restaurants, changes the picture. So in this case here, we're talking about 31% of the revenue in the sector comes from fish meal industry, the industrial fisheries there. The rest of it comes from seafood, from direct human consumption. The politicians down there, the Minister of Fisheries, was really quite interested in this because everything that we've done has been focused on this part here, as if that characterizes the whole industry. And when you look at employment, it's even more here. Restaurants are contributing. Most jobs are there. And 87% of the jobs are in the direct human consumption. So it actually is part of this is an important part of something that leads to changes in how fisheries are managed in Peru right now. The new legislation is on the way because this is a contributing factor to it, I should say it like that. And it's probably also going to be a contributing factor to changing some of this fish, that the anchoveta is going to be used increasingly for human consumption. It's a good fish for it. Oh my, I'm overloading you. I got a few more things. I see no one has touched the beer in the last half hour. It must be really dry by now. Yeah. Just a few things more. One is habitat capacity model, which Cam talked about in his course here. To me, that's a game changer for how we do spatial modeling, certainly in the context of EcoPOD with EcoSim. We are asking the question here, why are the species where they are? And for instance, I'll give you one example here from a study I'm working with right now. We're looking at development of a coastal site, a big development project. We have from models there, geomorphic models, we have depth, salinity, wave height, bottom current, before and after. And this site has been sampled over the last 2 or 3 years very extensively, especially in the tidal zone. So this up here is basically a tidal zone. This here is a big, in here you have 10, 20 meters depth just outside there. It's been studied really extensively. Then what we've done is we looked at how does, say, macrofauna and so on, polychaetes, how are they distributed with depth, with salinity, with wave, and with current, and so on, at present. We're also looking then at how, we're doing this for all the species. So here we have 57 species. We have depth, salinity, wave height, sediments, and currents. So we looked at how are species distributed with these factors. And based on that, that goes into this habitat capacity model that becomes factorial, goes in, and out of it comes beautiful maps. Beautiful maps we can dive into, and we can look at, from the sampling, how can we replicate that in this model? And the surprising answer was actually really, really well. That's the conclusion. This here is just a part of it, so you have to take my word for it. I'm a highly profane, is it profane professional, or is that just Carl's? No, trained professional is the word. Trust me. No, actually, it is. It gave a really good distribution of species. And then the assumption is when we have the geomorphic model to tell us the before and after the construction phase here, that we can use those characteristics to say something about what are the ecological consequences of this major construction. It's $1 billion construction we're talking about in this area, which in turn means how much mitigation does the proponent have to do in this area here to make up for that square kilometer that's being put in there of construction, wherever this is. So that's one area I find is really intriguing to see how well this has worked. And I think we'll see a lot of examples, a lot of further development, I should say, of this approach here. It's pretty neat. And then I have my own pet, which is global modeling. Been working for some years now on modeling the world ocean, basically. And doing that, we're having a number of layers, and doing it in some way, in a traditional way, by picking up from the biogeochemical models, that's the GFDL models, up from Princeton, physical environment parameters, modeling low trophic level species, high trophic level species, and going up to the human dimension up there, which actually we split down into a lot of different components which are focused on governance issues. This is work done with the Stockholm Resilience Center. They look at a lot of governance. We're looking for rules for how different management interventions, how they're going to work in different parts of the world, and based on that, scaling up so as to look at what are the implications of various policy measures for notably seafood, food security, and for biodiversity. That's the two issues. You mentioned the GBO4, Global Biodiversity Outlook. This is one of the areas where this is of interest. So at the moment what we've done, this submitted, is to look at the historic period here from 1950 up to 2006. How well can this model replicate the historic catches? That's been our measure because of the way we are interested, because of our interest in it. That's the bar we set. Can we get this model to pretty well replicate the historic catches? If we can that, maybe we can use it for looking into the future. Well, we are doing it, but that's our argument for being able to do it. And what we do then is to look at different scenarios. We're taking 4 different scenarios based on emissions and based on of governance structures for future, and looking at what are the consequences for food security and for biodiversity, because we're linking to a couple of thousand species and their distributions and their impact by fisheries and so on. So it's quite an effort, and that's actually where I'm spending my time. Majority of my time is on this activity here. And because we're talking about food security, one aspect of that is, fisheries are an important aspect of this, captive fisheries. But there's more to it. Aquaculture is a part. And this is a projection that came out from World Bank a couple of days ago, from a model by the International Food Policy Research Institute, a model called IMPACT. And what they are modeling is future demand for seafood. And they're making the assumption that demand will be met. So, and the only way that can be met this year is captive fisheries, been stagnating for the last 20 years. They're saying, well, that will continue. They're looking at agriculture increasing, and that will continue. So that we will be able to, they're estimating actually, they're starting by estimating the demand up there and then looking at what do we need to do to meet that. It's actually pretty neat work that's behind this, in this new report coming out. We are linking to this, and one of the questions we're asking is, what are the consequences of this aquaculture expansion? Where's it going to be? I've been working with a colleague there, Marc Metian. Actually, the Atomic Energy Commission is where he's placed now, but one aspect is they're working a lot with the environment at the Atomic Energy Commission. One aspect of this, where is aquaculture now? This here is the very first model run, which obviously is wrong because you won't find much aquaculture up in Hudson Bay, for instance. But it's just, we don't have enough parameters into it yet. But it's a big multiple regression. We're looking at country, by grid cells here, half-degree grid cells, how much water is there, how much population is there access to it, and then we look at about 20 countries now where we're looking at where is agriculture production taking place. We make a multiple regression